Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today I'm going to be doing exactly what it says in the title of the video. I'm going to be talking about the Nikon camera which started it all. The first thing I need to say before I go on any further is I'm going to be pronouncing Nikon as Nikon. I've gotten some comments in the past about how I pronounce the names of cameras, and of course the pronunciation of a particular brand of camera varies depending on where you happen to be. I know that in the Commonwealth countries, the preferred pronunciation is Nikon. In America, we use the expression Nikon, and you can first hear it in Paul Simon's old song Kodachrome. And here in Japan, it is called Nikon. So the three different variations of the name or pronunciation. So I'm going to stick with the pronunciation I grew up with because I remember this song when it was actually a top song back in the early 70s when I was a little kid. And I'm going to call this a Nikon. Nikon is actually a fairly old company, or a pretty old company. It was founded 106 years ago, and its original name was Nippon Kogaku, which stands for Japan Optical. And for nearly half a century, they specialized in the manufacture of optical lenses. Lenses for telescopes, microscopes, transits, and things like that. And they first started manufacturing serious camera lenses for the Canon company in the 1930s. And if you look at the very first Canon rangefinder film cameras, those were actually fitted with Nippon Kogaku or Nikkor lenses. It wasn't until after World War II that Japan got into the manufacturing of cameras. At the end of the war, Tokyo was pretty much leveled. There wasn't anything left in the city, but the companies themselves still existed in name. The 19 factories and 20-some thousand employees, which Nippon Kogaku had during the war, of course, were largely the factories destroyed and the workers displaced. The factory reorganized with a single factory with about, I think, about 1,500 workers or something like that. And in the years after the war, Japan was in a hurry to try to get its manufacturing going, because Japan is a country which, back then as now, doesn't really have much in the way of natural resources. And in order to get the things it needs, like food and materials and things like that, it has to export goods in exchange. The goal was for Japan's industry to get on its feet as quickly as possible, to sell products which would be popular in international markets and bring much needed, raw materials, supplies, food and such to Japan. When Japan was, or Nippon Kogaku was putting together its committees to design these cameras, they had several other committees there. Since they didn't really have a factory which was producing anything at the time, and they were starting from the ground up, they had considered getting into a lot of different types of manufacturing. And they'd actually had a division set up for the production of computers, mechanical computers at the time, because of course Japan didn't have the ability to manufacture electronic computers. I think no one in the world other than America did at that time. But Japan thought that it would be much easier to engineer and sell cameras and make money than to manufacture mechanical computers. So the mechanical computer division was shut down, and all their engineers were taught how to make cameras and brought over to design two cameras for the Nikon company. The two types of cameras that they were going to manufacture were a 6x6 twin lens reflex camera and a compact 35mm camera. The reason for the 6x6 format TLR camera was the popularity of these cameras in those days. That was pretty much the standard camera. 120 film was, I guess, the smaller format of film in those days, when press photographers were still using 4x5 inch large format cameras. And 120 film had a long history. It was still quite popular around the world. And so Japan, Nippon Kogaku thought that they would have a good market for the TLR cameras and probably a subsidiary market for the 35mm cameras. It wasn't until more than a decade later that 35mm cameras finally took over the market from medium format cameras. Unfortunately for Nippon Kogaku, they didn't have a success in the design of their twin lens reflex camera because they couldn't manufacture a shutter for it. For whatever reason, they didn't feel it was a good idea to outsource the manufacture of shutters for their cameras, and the cost of the tooling was just too high. So they abandoned the TLR camera and focused entirely on the 35mm camera. The next thing they had to do was come up with a name which could be used to market the camera, because no one in in the export market would be interested in buying a Nippon Kogaku camera. A lot of people weren't very, let's say, they didn't really like the name Nippon very much in the post-war years. So the Nikon's committees got together and tried to come up with a name. And oddly, one of the names which they almost took was Pentax. And of course, which was later taken by the Asahi optical company when they manufactured their Pentax cameras. Another choice which they almost went with was Nicorette. Nico being, of course, the first four letters of the words Nikon or Nico, and then et meaning small. So, for example, small Nikon was what they thought. And then they decided maybe we'll just make it simpler. A name like Nikon, only 5 letters, you can fit it easily on the front of the camera, it looks okay, and so they decided to go with that name. So that's the story of the name and why the camera was chosen. So let's go ahead and take a look at this camera here. And this camera that I'm going to be showing you is actually a Nikon S. It's not the very first camera which they made, which was the Nikon 1, and the later variation, which was known as the Nikon M. But this was the camera that actually made a name for Nikon among the professional photographer community, mainly when photographers came to Japan on their way to shoot in Korea for the Korean War. A lot of them who, I guess, didn't bring sufficient equipment with them, or wanted to bring backup equipment, decided to buy cameras to shoot. And a photographer from the Time Life company, or Life magazine in those days, decided to buy a Nikon camera and lens on the recommendation of a photographer who was living in Japan. And it was largely due to his influence and later other American photographers that the Nikon cameras took off in the eyes of the public. And it was the Nikon S which was this first, I guess, commercially successful 35mm camera. And this is the camera which Nikon pretty much owes its existence to today. Now, if you look at this camera, it looks very much like an old Contax camera with the kind of far apart viewfinder and rangefinder windows, along with this kind of focusing wheel here on the top, which focuses the lenses. The external appearance is very similar to the Contax, but the internal appearance is more consistent with the Leica. Rather than use the complicated vertical shutter design of the Contax cameras, they use more of the Leica-style horizontal focal plane shutter. And they went with more of a Leica-style rangefinder system, though if you look at this camera here, it doesn't really look anything like a Leica, but that was the main inspiration for the design. So taking I guess the best attributes of the two different designs, they combined them together and made the Nikon 1, the Nikon M, and the Nikon S. An odd thing was the first Nikon cameras, the 1 series, were developed in, I guess, 24x32 format, which was a popular format in Japan for 35mm film. And that's kind of what the industry in Japan was based upon. Things like slide projectors and enlargers and things like that were all designed for that format. Nikon had wanted to export these cameras, and when they decided to try to export them to America, GHQ, which was I guess, the ruler of Japan in the post-war era, said that Nikon could not export cameras in the 24x32 format because, I guess, Kodak more or less had a monopoly on slide projectors and things like that in America. Not really a monopoly, but well, pretty much Kodak was the big name in the game in those days in America. And in order to, GHQ is kind of practical in this. It might seem like that they were trying to favor Canon, or excuse me, Kodak in this situation, but the reality was they wanted Nikon to be able to sell cameras, and they knew that they wouldn't be able to sell them unless they could be used in machinery which was on the market in America at the time. And Nikon was kind of dismayed at this because the time and effort and money it takes to make the castings and the pressings and the machinery and everything, it's expensive and it takes time, and they didn't have a lot of money in those days. And the thought of completely redesigning the camera from the ground up so it could shoot a few 4mm larger format was just a little bit too much for them. But Fortunately, with a little bit of playing around with the camera, they were able to get it pretty close to the 24 by 36 format, and to be able to shoot 36 exposures on a roll of 35mm film. And GHQ approved the camera for export to the United States. GHQ is an interesting organization. It was headed by Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur. And the old GHQ building still stands today, and Douglas MacArthur's office in this building is left exactly as it was when he left all those years ago. It's been untouched since that time. And once a year or so, they open it up for a few days so people could go and take a look. But GHQ had a lot of say over what was made and exported from Japan, and Nikon learned this very early on. Before I take a look at the camera here, I'm just going to show you these other accessories which came with the Nikon S. This one still comes with its original leather case, which is not in bad condition when you consider its age. And inside the back here we have a card here, and this is a depth of field card. It says here depth of field, Nikon 50mm lens. And of course printed in English and arranged in feet, because these cameras were primarily designed for export to America. And that's one of the reasons that Nikon decided to sell cameras, because they thought that there would be a strong market among US servicemen. And when they were looking for products to sell, or when they were polling people, they found that there was a lot of interest among service members to buy cameras to, I guess, take photos while they were in Japan. Here we have the old style Nikon hood, which says Japan on it all the way around. And this one screws on the front. This isn't like the cone-shaped one which comes on the later cameras, kind of shiny aluminum. It looks a little bit odd, and it blocks the viewfinder a little bit, but this is like 1951 or so, so you can't be too demanding. They didn't have a lot of time to develop the accessories in those days. But overall, the fit and finish of everything, it may not be very finely designed, but the actual quality of everything, even the case and such, is quite high. At the Nippon Kogaku Tokyo setup on the back here. The camera itself is a very solid, rugged, and durable camera. It is quite heavy. You have to feel one of these cameras to understand how heavy it is. It is a pretty good chunk of metal. You can use this as a weapon if you had to. If you hit someone on the head with this, it's likely going to cause some permanent damage to them. I don't recommend you do that. But you can really feel the weight of this camera. It weighs as much as a Nikon F SLR camera with the larger 50mm SLR lens on it. But very interesting. I love the simplicity of the design on the top. Nikon made what engineers like to call a very elegant design, a no-nonsense design. It has just the things it needs where they happen to be needed the most, and it's very intuitive and easy to use. This particular camera here was sold via one of the PX, I guess, military post exchanges here in Tokyo. It still has the EP mark here on the rewind lever. This was required on all the things which were sold at the post exchange. The top of this camera is quite simple, very primitive compared to like the Leica cameras. The Leica cameras kind of put the viewfinder, rangefinder system on the top. Contacts put them on the inside, but by making a hybrid design of both of these cameras, you come out with this kind of very simplistic, very well laid out, and very easy to use system. Of course, we have the rewind knob here, which shows you which way to rewind the film. On this side here, we have the flash sync sockets. And this was another thing which was kind of required for export to America. People in America used flash bulbs, and people in Japan didn't use them so much back then. And the people who were importing these cameras to America insisted on having a flash sync connections, and so they were added. And we have two different ones here for fast and slow. And these use the old two-prong style flash sync connectors. You can get adapters where you can use the more modern PC sync sockets for these cameras. Not so hard to attach. You can use this camera with the flash if you go to the trouble to find the necessary adapters. Here we have the shoe for mounting the a flash gun or accessory finder. A large number of lenses were made for these cameras, everything from a 2.1 centimeter or 21 millimeter wide angle lens all the way to large telephoto lenses, which were, you don't see very much today, but I believe they even made a 1000 millimeter reflex lens in the old S mount. I've seen pictures of them, though I've never actually seen one in real life. But when you mount these accessory lenses, of course, you have to mount a finder because the viewfinder on the inside is very small and it doesn't adapt to the size. It's perfectly set up for the 50mm lens, and it should show roughly a 24 by 34 millimeter format when you are, I guess more like of a ratio through the viewfinder when you use it. Here, of course, we have the Nippon Kogaku emblem, which in later years was switched just to Nikon serial number. Here we have the shutter speed adjusting dial, and this is a two-piece dial. And this is very similar to the Leica design, or later Leica design, where we have the high speeds on top and the slow speeds on the bottom. And by turning these in combination, you can select the shutter speed which you want. This camera has your regular silk shutter curtains, which are rubber coated. They're usually quite durable, but on a camera which is this old, and this one's quite old, you're more than likely going to have, you know, some kind of shutter issues with these unless they've been very carefully stored. This one here does have some shutter problems and is going to need the shutter curtains replaced. I've got an old donor Nikon F, which I plan to remove the metal shutter curtains for and put them in this camera. They last longer, they're more accurate, they give better performance, so that's my project on this camera when I ever find time to do it. The shutter speed dial on the top has a range of speeds from 1/20th of a second to 1/500th of a second. And on the bottom here, we have a range of 1/8 of a second all the way to 1 second and a T setting. There's no bulb setting on this camera. What you would do if you needed to use it, you would just simply set it, to the T setting, and then trip the shutter, and then use your, you count however long you're going to count, or look at your watch, and then you simply turn the shutter speed dial, and that closes the shutter. To the top right here, we have the release switch, which is just like on the old Leica cameras. We have an A setting for operating the camera and R for releasing the winding mechanism. Here we have the shutter release button, and it has this collar which you can remove. If you remove this, you can thread on the old style cable release. You can't use the more standard modern cable release on this camera. You can buy adapters which will allow you to use a modern release, or of course you can always just find an old vintage release. Ones which are specific to Nikon cameras or twin lens reflex cameras, because most of those in the 1950s used the same setup. And of course here we have the film winding dial, which is a kind of a primitive system, and this is one of the reasons why this camera isn't as popular as the later S series, because you kind of have to wind it like the old Barnack Leicas, and that takes a little bit of time. On the back of the camera, pretty much nothing to see here other than the viewfinder eyepiece, which is quite small. It's still quite effective, and it has a single viewfinder window rather than like the combination finders which you find on other cameras of this era. A lot of these other cameras, they have two viewing windows on the back. One is for the actual viewfinder and the other is for the rangefinder, and some of them have magnification for increasing accuracy. This camera doesn't have that feature, but it does have a wide space here for the rangefinder and viewfinder, which gives you a little bit more precision in using the rangefinder focusing system. On the bottom of the camera here, we have a standard 1/4" tripod socket, and kind of the odd thing about this camera, which they did away with when they brought out the S2, is this double locking system for the film back. You have to turn both of these to the open position, and then remove the film back like so, or the film door, whatever you want to call it. Just like the later Nikon F SLR cameras, you load the film exactly the same way as you would load the Nikon F or the other S series cameras. Very simple. You just have to be careful not to lose or drop the cover on the back here, and you have to be careful to slide it on evenly on both sides. It's very easy to get it cocked one way or the other, and then these the feet here, or locking tabs, don't turn as easily as they should. If one is turning easily and one's not turning at all, it means that you don't have the rear cover on right. Take it off and just put it on more carefully so it locks up. On the front of the camera, we have a lot of the important stuff, and the most important feature of this camera, and really what made this a popular camera, is the lens. This particular camera is fitted with the 5cm f1.4 Nikon lens, and this is of course a copy of the Contax sonar lens, the 50mm f1.5, which came on the earlier Contax cameras. This was what was the big selling point to these cameras, was the high quality lenses which Nikon was able to engineer for them. When they did tests of these lenses, comparing them to the lenses, similar lenses produced by Leica and Contax at the time, everyone preferred the performance of the Nikon or Nikkor lenses. They were sharper, they resolved better, and they were just better performers, and also very well made. One thing I like about these lenses is they're very durable. The coating is durable, it's not easily scratched, which is a real issue with lenses like the Leica Summicron, which is incredibly easy to scratch. They don't often have the lens separation issue, which the Contax sonar lenses have, and I've come across too many of the sonar lenses where the front element is separated. You can kind of see it. Sometimes it's just minor, you don't notice it, and other times you can see it quite clearly. That's not an issue with these lenses. They were just very well made and very well designed, and it was a very difficult thing in a country like Japan in those days, which didn't have a lot of access to raw materials, including things like optical glass. But they made the best with what they had, and they did a really wonderful job. As I said, we have a focusing wheel here, which you use to focus the lens, and there's a focusing tab, or infinity lock, I should say, on the top here, which prevents the lens from turning by itself. And this way, if you turn the lens to infinity and you put it in your bag, it's going to stay at infinity. It's not going to move to another distance when you pull the camera out, unless you happen to grab it right here. And this is good. This is kind of an interesting feature for, I guess, press photographers and correspondent photographers, where they're running or whatever. They have to get the camera out quickly to take a photo, and they want to start with it at infinity and then focus in closer from there. And the infinity lock system it makes that it's a feature which they really like. The other thing, another reason that Nikon went with this design, the Contax design, was they wanted a bayonet mount lens. They didn't want a screw mount type lens. The bayonet mount lens, it's very easy. It's just as simple as that to put the lens on. Whereas if you're a press photographer and you were shooting, a screw mount lens, you have to put the lens in. You have to screw it all the way. First, you have to screw out the old lens or put in the new one, and then you have to put it on just about right. And sometimes the rangefinder wheel, which regulates the rangefinder, it's not lined up on the back of the lens right, and you can't get it started. It's kind of a real pain in the butt. But the design, by using the Contax design, Nikon was able to get around that, and that was another reason why these were quite popular with the war correspondents during the Vietnam War. And the reputation that these cameras got during the Korean War, I shouldn't say Vietnam War, Korean War, made them popular with photographers who came to Japan and then traveled onward to Vietnam. And Nikon sold a lot of their F-model cameras based on the reputation gained by these S-model rangefinder cameras. Removing the lens here, like so, you simply depress this little spring here, and you turn the lens to the right. That unlocks it, and you can remove it. And around the front here, you can see the focusing scale here, which shows you how many feet you are when you're using a standard 50mm lens, what your focal, I guess, the focusing distance is. And above that, you have a depth of field scale, showing how much depth of field you have at any given aperture. The interesting thing about these cameras, the Nikon cameras, is this double bayonet mount system. There's an internal bayonet mount, which this lens has, and it fits on the inside of the bayonet, or the mount, and you just turn it that way and it locks in place. And you focus the lens using the focusing wheel, or you can use the lens itself. For the other telephoto lenses and a lot of the wide angle lenses, which are heavier or of a different design, they have to put the lens closer toward the inside and therefore move the lens closer to the body. There's a secondary mount, and if you are using, say, 28mm, 35mm, or the longer lenses, they attach to this. And for the advantage of this mount over the internal mount for the larger lenses is that if the lens gets really heavy, it's actually quite difficult to focus with the focusing wheel. This lens it's a really solid piece of brass, which is chrome plated with a very large piece of glass, or pieces of glass inside, and it's quite heavy. And if the helicoid isn't very, very clean, it can be a little bit hard to turn. And Nikon's fastest lenses, the 50mm f1.1, that's like triple the weight of this. And when the earlier lenses came with this standard 50mm bayonet mount, and they were really, really hard to focus. And plus, they put a lot of weight on the helicoid. So the later lenses and the telephoto lenses were designed to attach to the front of the camera rather than the focus helicoid. And of course, you can focus these lenses by using the focusing ring on the lens itself. Now, the best lenses which came with this camera, the most highly regarded lenses are the regular 50mm or 5cm f1.4 and the 3.5cm f1.8. And that tends to be more highly regarded than the 50mm lens, and that's kind of reflected in the price. Here in Japan, you can get a pretty good 50mm Nikon lens in really good condition for about $200. And a 35mm f1.8 lens in clean condition is going to be at least $1,000. They're quite expensive and very desirable. You can, of course, use, if you can find one, the Millennium Nikon lens, which came on the S3 2000 that fits in this camera with no problem. Those are similarly priced to the 35mm or 3.5cm Nikon lenses. And the 50mm f2, which was standard in a lot of these cameras, you could get usually with the f2.0, sometimes with 1.4. That is also a wonderful performer, and it's a little bit more compact and it's lighter in weight. Nikon also made an f3.5 lens, a collapsible lens. And those are a little bit less popular. A lot of people, you know, they like the marketing, I guess the marketing advantages or the advantages sold by the marketing department over faster lenses. In those days when film speeds were quite slow, having a faster lens was a way which you could take photographs in darker situations. With the advent of flash photography made that a little bit less important, but yeah, those are the two, the lenses. On my other cameras, the ones which I described in my more recent Nikon rangefinder videos, I've shot with both of those, the 35mm f1.8 and the Millennium Nikon, and they're both outstanding. I actually prefer the 50mm focal length, so I prefer the Millennium Nikon. Oddly, I haven't actually shot any film with one of these 5cm f1.4 lenses, and I really have to go out and give it a try and see what it can do. I did have an old Contax 2A, I believe it was, with a 50mm f1.5. I got it really cheap and it was a piece of junk which didn't work. And I sent it to my friend Oleg, who is in the Ukraine, and he overhauled the camera for me and sent it back, and it came back wonderfully, wonderfully working. And I went out and I shot with it, and I was simply amazed at the quality of photos which I could get from that Sonara f1.5 lens. And if this lens is supposed to be better than that one, I'd really love to see how well it can do. Now, this is a really cool camera for people who want something which is simple, rugged, reliable, and you really love the look of, I guess, machinery. For myself, I've always been fascinated by machines and mechanical things since I was really young, and the design of a camera like this is really appealing. It's just quite simple. It kind of reminds me of like old machine guns from like the First World War. The layout is very similar with the levers and buttons and things like that. Not that I've had a lot of experience shooting World War I machine guns, but it kind of gives you an idea of the style, and that wasn't very far in the past when these cameras were made. This camera is pretty cool, and it still has its original lens cap. It's kind of odd. Sometimes I buy one of these cameras and I buy the complete thing, and I find that the camera and the lens might not be worth so much, but one of the accessories, the accessories are. So I bought for example, a 21mm Nikon F lens, the old style, which has the long element and the viewfinder you have to put on the top. And for whatever reason, this didn't have the F style viewfinder. It had the S style for the Nikon screw mount rangefinder cameras, and this viewfinder was worth a ridiculous amount of money. And another time I got a bunch of camera junk, and there was an old 3.5mm f1.8 lens hood, which is also worth a lot of money. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting market, things like this. This one here I don't think is worth anything really much, but it's quite possible. That's kind of one of the cool things about these old cameras. If you like shooting with film, you like vintage photography, you like something which is fully mechanical, this is probably a camera which you might be interested in. But anyway, this video is getting close to half an hour long, and I don't have a lot of time to do the editing and all that, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the video short here or end it here. I may sell this camera one of these days when I get the shutter curtains replaced in it, so maybe you might want to check back in a couple of months if you're interested in buying a camera like this. Or someone who wants one, I can probably find one in working condition. You can contact me through my stores if you're interested. I plan to be making more videos as I have the time, and if you want to see these videos, please subscribe. And if you like the video, of course, please click the like button. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.